Good morning, and thank you for attending ITSM Academy's monthly Webucation. My name's Karen Skiles, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Today, we're pleased to have DJ Shalene, DevSecOps Evangelist and Security Architect from Aetna, joining us. Today's presentation is titled Automating Security Controls with DevSecOps. We've got quite a few registrations for today's webinar, so let's give everyone a few minutes to log in and get settled. Some of you may have firewalls blocking you from accessing the Citrix webinar tool that we use. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, you can download the slides directly from the link in the chat box on your screen or from our website at www.itsmacademy.com/webinar-archives. And be sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn for the latest IT Service Management and ITSM Academy updates and specials, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for free webinars and inspiration. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. I'll be right back. Good morning and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Karen Skiles, and I'm pleased to be your host for today's webinar. We've been delivering our monthly revocations to you since 2007, and we're very happy to see so many of you joining us today for this webinar. We're pleased to have DJ Shalin, DevSecOps Evangelist and Security Architect from Aetna, joining us. Today's presentation is titled Automating Security Controls with DevSecOps. We've got a few polling questions. To give DJ a little sense of our audience today. So our first polling question is, do you know the difference between DevOps, DevSecOps, and DevXOps? Please make your selection. If you want to, you can download the slides for today's presentation directly from the link in our chat box from our website at www.itsmacademy.com webinar-archives. We'll be tweeting during this presentation as well. If you'd like to join in, please use hashtag AskITSM. Again, that's hashtag AskITSM. We've got 79% voted, so we're going to, there we go, 84%. So we're going to close the polls. Okay. And share it. So DJ, 13% are yes, 69% are no, and 19% are not sure. Okay, here's our second poll. Why are you attending this webinar? Please make your selection. During the webinar, the information that DJ shares may raise some questions, or you may be looking for some additional clarification or information. We will have a Q&A session with him at the end of the presentation. Please submit your questions using the question feature that appears on the GoToWebinar control panel, which is located in the upper right corner of your screen. Just type your question and click the send button. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the webinar. We will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The webinar and the Q&A are being recorded and will be made available to you on our website by the end of business tomorrow. Okay, we've got over 80%. We're going to close the poll. And on this one, DJ, we have 33% wanted to see how IDLE plugs into DevOps. 39% are curious. 17% because DevSecOps is a hot topic, and 11% was others. So just let me take a peek at the chat and see. Yeah, I don't see anything in the chat. Okay, but 11% were other. Okay, we have another poll for you. Is your organization practicing any of the following? And please click all that apply on this one. This is a multiple, so you can use more than one selection here. So we're ready to get started. For those of you new to ITSM Academy, here's a quick overview. ITSM Academy is a full-service provider of IT service management education. We develop most content in-house. Our portfolio includes IDLE, Agile Service Management, DevOps, Process Design, and Verisum. Since 2003, we've trained and certified tens of thousands of students. Okay, so we're going to close this poll. Okay, and DJ, we've got 50% at Waterfall, 88% with Agile, 81% DevOps, 38% DevSecOps, and 6% not sure. Okay, great, thank you. And we have one more poll for you. If your organization is adopting DevOps, what stage is it in? Please make your selection. And again, you can enter your questions at any time at all during the webinar. So if it comes up, please just put it right in the questions feature in the control panel. And please try to be specific enough so that we can get make sure that we understand what the question is about, because we won't be on that slide again at the end when DJ comes back to that. Okay, so we're going to close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. All right. So DJ, we've got in the lead 31% gaining traction. We've got a tie at 15% for planning and beginning steps, and we have 38% that are not sure where their company is. And that's not unusual. We've seen that a lot. So thank you so much for sharing that information with DJ and giving him a better sense of our audience today. Much appreciated. So, excuse me. So now let me introduce DJ Shalene. DJ is a DevSecOps pioneer and currently works as a DevSecOps evangelist and security architect for Aetna, a large healthcare organization. He provides DevSecOps thought leadership throughout their journey of cultural revolution and digital transformation. DJ specializes in automating security controls in DevSecOps environments and is an ethical hacker, as well as doing significant R&D work in moving target defense, mobile security, systems exploitation, and penetration testing. As an expert in application lifestyle management and IDLE, DJ has worked to streamline development pipelines for many Fortune 100 organizations by focusing on people, process, and the right technology. He is an active speaker, blogger, instructor, and author in the growing DevSecOps community, where he encourages organizations to deeply integrate a culture of security into their core values and product development journey. Good morning, DJ.
Good morning. How is everyone today?
I think we're good.
Awesome. That's great. It's great to see so
How
many
are you
people
this
join.
morning?
I'm awesome. I'm enjoying life at 6,200 feet above sea level in beautiful Golden, Colorado, right in the foothills.
Lovely. Is the sun up?
It's actually overcast today, which is quite odd for Colorado. We get about 300 sunny days per year. So hopefully that brings a lot of people to Colorado. It's really interesting because you can actually golf in the morning, go snowboarding in the afternoon, and come back, and it's back to normal weather. So it's an interesting environment over here.
Nice. I'm in Fort Lauderdale, so I just prefer summer all year. But I appreciate that you like that difference. I know a lot of people like the changes in seasons. Are you ready for me to make you presenter?
Absolutely.
Okay. There you go. Oh, I can see your screen perfectly also.
Oh, great. Well, yeah, hello everyone. As Karen mentioned, I'm DJ Shalene, and I'm from Aetna. And what I do is I'm a security architect over there, and I focus a lot in DevSecOps and how we adopt it and how we inject security controls into everything we do. And it's been quite an interesting challenge. I'm really excited today to talk to everybody about what we're doing over there. So, these are a couple great quotes. You build it, you run it, and you build it, you secure it. And this is an interesting kind of conversation. I met John Willis from, he wrote the DevOps handbook with a bunch of other folks. And I met him in 2017 at RSA in San Francisco. And I remember at that time, DevSecOps wasn't really a term that everybody was aware of. And there was a lot of conflict in the industry about DevOps or Dev Test Ops or Dev Qua Ops or that kind of thing. And I had many conversations with him afterwards, and I think that eventually he understood the importance of having security inside of DevOps. And now he's a DevSecOps evangelist, which is really, really awesome. The idea here is when we're building software, we really have to pay attention to how it gets out to our customers. So from a feature request or from a change that comes in to how we release that software, it's very important that we pay attention to it and we increase the quality of that software as we move along. I always look at deploying software and releasing software, and a good corporate citizenry is not to release software with any vulnerabilities. And traditionally, it's been hard to get to that point because the tools just haven't been mature. And DevOps and DevSecOps gives us the opportunity to really track with good KPIs and good technique, good people, and the cultural change that lets us get security out to our customers and secure quality code, to really make the world a better place. And at Aetna, we also assume that people are providing us software that is secure as well. And all of our customers across the world really are at a point where they need secure software. We have to make sure that we're not introducing vulnerabilities. And if we do find a vulnerability, that we can fix it very quickly. So a bit about Aetna. We were founded in 1873, and our first computer was a IBM mainframe that we purchased in 1954. So imagine that, 101 years of using paper spreadsheets rather than any computing power. And that actually is sort of mind-blowing because in the last, some years since that 1954 first computer purchase, the technology has changed quite a bit. We've gone through a bunch of different methodologies for delivering, such as waterfall, agile. We've had different scaled agile frameworks and a whole bunch of different ways to develop software. And we've pretty much experienced the whole gamut at Aetna. We have about 50,000 employees worldwide. That's about to dramatically increase. And it makes it very interesting to have standards across that organization and making sure that we're aligning all of our technologies, and we also know what other teams are doing. There might be situations where we have a DevOps team that's grassroots in Denver, and we have no awareness that there's one somewhere else in the world as well. So we're starting to get through that by really communicating a lot better and making sure that when we do something like DevSecOps, that everybody is aware that that's our programs. And an interesting thing about DevSecOps, when we started introducing the concept of DevOps into Aetna, I pretty much argued and not even argued, but suggested and kept at everyone to really adopt DevSecOps as the term, because we wanted to inject that culture of security into DevSecOps. And DevSecOps, the word comes from DevOps, obviously, and the idea that we had was, if you put security in front of DevOps, then you're leading with security and nobody follows you. And if you put it at the end of DevOps and it's DevOps Sec, you're following with security. And that's sort of always how it's been. Security has always been an afterthought in product development. And so if we put it in the middle, what it allows us to do is really be some glue that takes development and operations and brings them together in a secure state. So at the end of the day, we're really affecting both organizations, the development organizations and the operations organizations, and how they come together to form a DevOps team. And we're injecting security into that. We have about 39 million members. So these are folks that we provide health insurance for, and those are folks all across the world. Some of our recent acquisitions was Bupa in Thailand and in Bangkok. And I just recently came back from an Asia tour, and it's really exciting to see that DevSecOps is really a worldwide movement that people have really got a hold of and really started to pay attention to. We're number 49 on the Fortune 500, so we're quite a large company with quite a large revenue. And in being a large company, it's very difficult to ensure that everybody is on the same page about DevSecOps and the adoption, as I mentioned. So the core of DevSecOps, I call it the three pillars, and I'm going to go through these and explain a little bit about each one of them and how the three of them form the foundation of not just DevOps, but DevSecOps. And the first one is culture. Culture, I believe, is the number one thing that you need to have in an organization to foster a innovative and creative DevOps and DevSecOps teams. So the idea is to communicate. It's to ensure that people are talking to each other. For example, I worked at a affiliate of Aetna called iTriage in Denver, Colorado, and that's where I started my journey inside of Aetna. And when I walked in for my interview, they asked me to join a release planning session, and they had the entire organization, HR, executives, accounting, you name it. There was people from everywhere in the organization that came into our developer area, and we had this thing called a release fair. And they did this every 6 weeks. So they had 6 iterations that were 2 weeks in length. And at the end of every iteration, they would do a release. And so this release fair went through all the features that would be developed for the next release. And they had these boards, and it was almost like an art project to create these, where we would pin all of our work items and all of our tasks that we were doing for the next 6 weeks into this board. And we had like 100% certainty for the first iteration. We go 80, 60, 40, and 20. And our last iteration was what we called a hardening improvement, and it was like a hip sprint, I guess we could call it, where people could harden all of the applications that they or the features that they developed in the past couple of iterations. They could also innovate and create new projects that may have nothing to do with the product, or maybe have something to do with the product direction. And some of those innovation projects actually rolled into the product itself that we put out to the public. And doing that really enables the teams to have a say in where that product is going, and also try to discover new technologies, new ways of doing things. The second pillar is technique, and these are the processes that you adopt in order to implement DevSecOps and DevOps. So technique would be how you build your software and how it goes through from a feature or a change that's executed and needs to be done to releasing it to production and everything that happens in between. And DevOps and DevSecOps are very interesting that they vary from organization to organization. We refer to it as almost like a subway map, and each city has a different subway and a different layout, but at the end of the day, it's all about getting product from point A to point B, or customers or users of the subway from point A to point B. And there's many different ways to configure your systems and your operations, but the main thing to take away from this is that the technique you adopt should be the technique and the way that your organization operates. If you adopt DevOps or DevSecOps and you force it to be a certain pattern, you're going to really break that culture potentially, or the way things operate, and you might introduce some drag to the process, or some really negative effects. So make sure that the techniques that you use are things that your teams are used to, and then augment them with new techniques to adopt DevSecOps. And tools is the final one. They always say that a fool with a tool is just a fool. And tools should always follow the technique and the culture of the organization. What this means is you need to select the right tools for the job. And you don't take a hammer and drive a nail in where an architect has said, oh, put this nail in the wall. And if you can't fit a hammer in that area, then you can't do that. So again, it's choosing the right tool. It could be a source control repository where you're keeping your source code. It could be a build tool. It could be a security control or security tool set. And each organization has different requirements for that. And they're all different. And the idea is to select the appropriate tool for the job that you're doing, which is putting product into production. So let's get into the importance of DevSecOps. And I always say it's not just another movement. A lot of people have, gone from a waterfall to an agile environment, and they think that, oh my gosh, we have to adopt DevSecOps or DevOps, and it's going to replace our existing agile methodology that we're used to. And the reality of this is DevSecOps and DevOps are more of a parallel to agile. And really, you can do DevOps with waterfall. It's just it's one of these concepts I have in my head. It's a little bit different, but it's taking a feature, taking a change, and running that through the process. And yeah, you might queue that up, but it's that pipeline of tools that gets it to a state of release. And that's where you really want to be. So it's a parallel track. It doesn't replace Agile. In fact, it augments it. If you look at the Scaled Agile Framework 4.5, that framework introduces DevOps into the agile methodology. Now the problem with it is they don't mention anything about security, and I believe that if you don't put security into your products and into your pipelines of creating products, then it's almost like having a car with no airbags, and a car with no high mounted brake light. A lot of these safety features were introduced to automotive industry to protect people. And that's what we're really trying to do with secure software, is really protect our end users and make sure that they don't lose their personal health information or their personal identification information. So things about them that identify who they are, where they live, this is that privacy that we want to make sure that we maintain. And it's not just something that we want to do, it's something that we have to do. There's a lot of regulations that the government has put out, like HIPAA and PCI, and these have severe and high cost fees if some information gets leaked, or a lot of the personal health information gets out to the general public or gets breached and hacked. That's something that we just don't want. So, imagine having your health information on the internet, and that affects your insurance qualifications or potentially a job that you're applying for. So some of the importance of DevOps specifically, and DevSecOps, is we end up spending less time on unplanned work and more time on new work. And these numbers are a bit conservative. I always think, just from experience, that 70% of the work and the features that go through to production are remediation for bugs and vulnerabilities and features that may not work like they were planned to. And then 30% is spent on new work. And what we want to try to do is turn the tables on that and make sure that we can quickly remediate issues and not acquire any technical debt, and spend up to 70% on new work. And with that, we're constantly improving our products, and we're constantly improving the security of our products that go out. So some of the numbers around this is we have a 46-time improvement in deployment frequency. And that is a huge improvement. We have 440 times faster lead time for changes, 96 times faster mean time to recovery, and we have a lower change failure rate. We're a fifth as likely to have these failures. And what these are, at the end of the day, are KPIs and metrics that we want to collect throughout our development process. We want to make sure that we know how long it takes for an issue or a remediation, a bug, to go from development and go out to production. The faster we do that, the more we condition our teams to react to change. And that's one of the huge advantages of DevSecOps. We're constantly improving. We fail fast, we fail often, but when we track KPIs and metrics around these, delivery, product delivery throughout the process, we can improve them. If we don't have this information, we can't improve on this. And its visibility is key to having all of this work out. So here's the comparison between Agile and DevSecOps. I removed waterfall from this diagram because it's basically a linear process. And with waterfall, you may deliver once or twice a year. With Agile, we're looking at weeks to months. So in the case of iTriage, we had 6 iterations, and at the end of that iteration, we'd release software. The problem with that is we end up having quite a few features that build up in our backlog that are ready to go into production and ready to be released, but they, if something happens in the meantime, this turns into stale code pretty quickly. And the problem with this is keeping a log of all the changes that went out, and having these massive changes that hit production all at once increases your risk of something going wrong. And the remediation that comes out of that is something that disrupts your next iteration and your next release cycle. So with DevSecOps, what we do is we start planning and we start identifying the things that we want to do and identifying the changes. So, these could be a reaction to an incident or a problem that is identified, or, some sort of help desk request, product request, or even the product owner planning a new feature. So what we're doing here is we're iterating through design, build, test, deployment, and operation. And these are on a feature level. And we learn from each iteration and each feature that we develop, and we ship those out immediately. So I always like saying that I deploy 50 times before breakfast and before my first coffee. And that kind of comment means that I can implement a feature. So for example, I could change a button color or the content of a web page or how it operates. And as soon as that feature is done, I push it right to production. And these can be minutes or hours. It really depends on how conditioned your development team is and your DevSecOps team is to getting this out the door. It also depends on how tuned your pipeline is. And I don't think I explained what a pipeline is, but it's a series of events that happen in the delivery of a product. And the whole idea of this is we're focusing on productivity. We want to ensure that we enable our developers to make decisions on the technologies they use, the implementation of how they're creating these features. So for example, if we're using a microservice architecture, and microservice just being a set of code that does one thing and does it very well. So for example, a user service that onboards users, lets them modify their user attributes in their profile, and potentially removes users if they want to close their account. And that's all that this microservice does. And this could integrate with other services that might provide additional functionality. These microservices technically don't have to be the same language. So before DevSecOps, we had this idea as large organizations that we had to deploy the same structure, the same tools, the same plugins, and enforce the same language restrictions across our development teams. And what we're doing by doing that is the developers that we bring on and we recruit that come into the organization may specialize in a different technology than some of the other developers, and they might take a long time or a bit of time to get up to speed on frameworks and code reviews and code standards, how things are done. And what we're doing in that situation is we're really prohibiting that developer from being very productive. And a lot of organizations might look at this and say, well, how do we do this if service A is in Python and service B is in Go and service C is in .NET? And my answer to that is, if you have a contract of how these services interact with each other, it really doesn't matter. The thing that we want to take away from this is you want to use more modern languages. So we're not going to be using, TCL or Tickle for this, or some Fortran or COBOL. What we're going to be doing is using the technologies of today, and that's really where your developers want to be. And that's why they're coming to your organization, because they want to be challenged. They want to do the latest technologies. They definitely want to do DevOps and DevSecOps. And you're creating an environment where they can do what they do best. And that breeds a great culture. Culture can't be forced from the executive level down. Culture is nurtured, and culture grows organically. So what we want to do as leaders is create the guardrails on the road that our developers travel. So we want to make sure they don't go off the road and go rogue and create something that doesn't really isn't really a feature, and it's not adding value to our product. But we want to give them the flexibility to experiment and to do what they do best. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about security controls. And these are 4 technologies and 4 different tool sets. And these are the 4 that, if you're adopting DevSecOps, you want to put in to your development pipelines. And so I'm going to go through these, and they're almost in the order that you want to deploy them, and they're quick wins. And the first quick win is getting open source software management and integrated into your development processes. And what open source software management does is take a look at the third-party components that you're bringing into your application and analyzing them for vulnerabilities. So a lot of organizations don't know how much or how many, third-party components make up their product at the end of the day. A lot of developers are free to pull down open source software from repositories such as GitHub or potentially Docker Hub. And for example, in the state of, or in the example of Apache struts, this is the Equifax breach that happened, and it was because of a third-party library. It wasn't part of the code that was created by Equifax, but it was a result of bringing in these vulnerable libraries. And the difficulty with that situation is they knew about these vulnerabilities and didn't do anything for months. And if you look at some of the statistics that came out after that, it was pretty much the same amount of people that were pulling down that vulnerable repository for almost a year afterwards, which is unbelievable. People knew about the vulnerability, but people kept pulling it down. So this is where some open source software tools come into play, and they'll capture any tool that comes through from the internet, and they'll do vulnerabilities, and it also creates an inventory of these tools. So if there is a breach, we know who is using this tool, what version we're bringing in, and what products it's eventually getting into. And when we talk about pipelines later on in this presentation, I'll show you the best place to put these tools. This diagram here is the amount of open source components at Aetna and how they've increased over the years. So when we look back at 2016, we might have had less than 750 components that were pulled in for all of our applications. And now, as of February this year, and it's growing every month, we have almost 1,500 open source components that we're bringing in, and these are the ones that we know about. And the vulnerabilities that can be in these third-party libraries is something that we need to know. We need to make sure that we don't have these vulnerabilities, and not just for third-party open source components, but for any code that we're bringing in from our vendors. We want to make sure that if we're bringing in code and bringing in an application to do something in our environment, and that could be anything from accounting software to development software, we want to know what the vulnerabilities in these applications are, because we're bringing them into our environment. So for example, we had a third-party vendor, or a vendor that actually gave us a Docker container. So a piece of portable functionality that we can deploy into our environment. And this image that created this application had critical vulnerabilities that my 4-year-old daughter could have exploited without any knowledge of coding or technology. So we threw that back at the vendor and said, you got to fix these things before we put this into our environment. I was walking around RSA in the expo floor earlier this year, and I met one of our vendors who was giving us a open source software management tool, actually, sorry, a dynamic analysis tool that looked at the attack surface from an external perspective. And I asked them, do you do static code analysis on the code that you're shipping out to your customers or the products that you're shipping out? And they said no. And it was just unbelievable. A security vendor who's creating security software isn't scanning their software for security vulnerabilities. And that was a shocking revelation that really changed the way that we bring in software at Aetna. So we had a program around this. The idea of implementing these tools is not just to put them in and press the scan button. We also have to ensure that we have training, we have processes, we have onboarding documents and playbooks that wrap around these tools that we're bringing in. So we're in this process right now where we are dropping the CVSS score. So these are the scores of vulnerabilities. They're based on the severity and the impact of the vulnerability itself. And 10 is the highest. So we started off and saying, okay, we want to have in Q1 18 a score of less than 10. And we introduced that as a measurement for all our development teams to get conditioned to how where we want to go with these scores and the vulnerabilities for the open source software that we bring in. In Q2, we drop that threshold to 7. And with the tools we use, we can just prohibit these from even entering our environment. And that starts scaring a lot of developers. Like, well, how do we implement these third-party tools? We rely on these, and we're concerned that it's going to break our software if we can't bring in these components that have a score of 8. And my opinion on that is you have a couple different choices as a developer. You can choose another tool, and that might take a lot of integration effort and might blow out a budget for a specific feature. Or they can change the application and do a pull request, creating a copy of that third-party component, fix the vulnerability, and contribute it back to the open source community. And again, that comes to good corporate citizenship. If we're pulling down third-party components and we're not contributing back, it's doing a disservice to the community itself. We're taking, but we're not giving. And if we can give back to the community, we're making the world a safer place, and we're making it easier to implement these controls or these components in other software that other companies are releasing. Now in Q3 18, we're going to Epicfail them all. So if you introduce any vulnerabilities based on third-party components, we're going to fail the open source software management process of our development pipelines. This definitely scares a lot of product owners and a lot of developers, but we've given them time to adapt and to adjust. We've shown the program and where we want to go. It's definitely aggressive, but it's definitely necessary, especially in this day and age where breaches have become so frequent that we almost get so used to it we don't even pay attention to them. It just seems like noise. And we want to get to the point where, again, our software is secure. So visibility is key to these third-party components. This is a screenshot to the left of the screen that shows our open source software management and the things that it detects. So we can tell not just our critical vulnerabilities in these components, we can also identify license issues. And this also identifies license issues and security vulnerabilities in the code that the organization or your organization creates. So it's a very good tool to look at the criticality of the components you're bringing in and also the licenses, because you can have a license that instantly open sources the production code and your intellectual property that you put out to the public. And open sourcing your intellectual property is a risk for the organization. So ensuring that the code you put out has the appropriate licenses with the third-party components is an absolute must. A lot of these tools as well can be integrated into developer IDEs, or the tools that they use to create the software. And as they're integrating these into the software, it will, right inside of their IDE, tell them they're introducing a vulnerability. And for example, it might be jQuery, which is used in a lot of dynamic websites, and it provides a jump starter functionality to developers to create dynamic websites. A lot of organizations still use an old version of jQuery that's 1.12. There's been multiple updates of this library over the years, and I think now it's up around version 3. Bringing that in there's a couple of different things that we want to look at. We want to look at, is it going to be a breaking change, or can we update that library to a version that has no security vulnerabilities and doesn't break the application? If it doesn't break the application, a developer can click a button and it'll automatically remediate that library and bring it up to the latest non-issue or non-vulnerability version of the component. And that in itself makes security remediation a lot easier at the development perspective. The whole idea of DevOps, you're going to hear this all the time, is moving things left. And as we start looking at the pipeline later in this document, or this presentation, we'll see that moving things back to the developer is key. When you detect a vulnerability and it's something that a developer checked in, and you fail a build, or you toss it back to the developer, these are the folks that know exactly what they changed in the application, and they're the perfect resource to remediate these issues because they've just been in the code. If you ship this out to production, and let's say that resource leaves and you notice this vulnerability later, then it gets kicked back into your feature team and your development team. And the problem is, it's at that point technical debt. Your new developers or new people, or the resource that you assign to it, might not know what this change is, what it does, how it was integrated into the software, and that's going to increase their work effort to remediate that issue. So the second tool that is a quick win is if you're using containers. And what we want to do here, in a container, for those who aren't familiar with containerization and how that works, if you take, for example, a physical machine that in the 1990s and 2000s you used to host a website, a lot of times they're hosted on a Windows machine or a Linux machine, and they have every single piece of functionality that operating system uses as part of that physical server. So you're going to have a desktop, you're going to have Bluetooth libraries, you're going to have audio libraries, you're going to have animation software, and potentially a whole Office suite of tools. And that's going to be a really large installation. So we're looking at gigs of information, or gigabytes of information and tools, and a physical machine that we have to remote into and manage from a remote location, or we might even have to walk up to the machine in our data center and reboot it, which is definitely not a effective way to operate modern organizations. The second thing that happened with the evolution of hosting software was virtual machines. And virtual machines have their own boot sequence. They are almost like a physical machine, but they're compartmentalized on your host platform. And you can run maybe 2 or 3 on a physical piece of hardware. And these things boot very slowly. They still have all the libraries that are unnecessary. And they can be updated in a similar fashion, but they're really just a stopgap to what containers do. So if you think about taking that virtual machine and crushing it down, so it goes from potentially 11 gigs or 4 gigabytes, and you crush that down into a container, you may get to the point where your container is only 125 megabytes. And that creates a very small footprint. There's nothing in these containers that aren't needed to run your website or your web services or your applications. And what that does is it reduces your attack surface for your applications. And that is extremely important, because if you're deploying software on a full installation of Windows or Linux, and there's a vulnerability that comes out for a library that has nothing to do with the software you're developing, you still need to remediate it. If you're in a container, you're not affected by that. And a lot of the things that containers do is they boot up very quickly because they share the underlying kernel of your host operating system. So the way that machine boots up, and they start in potentially 55 milliseconds. Like, it's incredibly quick because they don't have to boot up. They're just there. And with that, we can cycle our applications very quickly. We can do rolling updates. We can scale an application in seconds. And we can go from one container to 100 very rapidly. And what's important about that is cost for running applications. We can run about potentially 12 to 20 containers on a host rather than 2 virtual machines or 1 physical host. And that reduces our cost, especially if we're moving to a cloud platform. And when we can dynamically expand it, we pay for that expansion in the cloud, but it'll go back to just being potentially 1 container. And that will allow us to save costs and be expandable. So we can handle a load of users coming into the application. I always compare this to open enrollment for healthcare. It usually hits around the same time every month or every year for every organization. And with that open enrollment, when it's May or June and nobody's doing this, maybe there's 1 or 2 for employees coming in or something to that effect, like where you're doing new benefit registrations. If if these things go out at the end of the year and you have more people going into these applications, it just expands out, and then it'll contract after open enrollment's over. And it does this automatically, and it's going to save money in the long run and reduce your overall budget for your product development and your hosting environment. And this is a actual image that I pulled down. So this is Debian Jessie. So it's a base operating system that makes up a container. And if we look at what's happening on the left-hand side, you don't have to be a coder to understand that the bottom 2 are vulnerable. And there's 3 critical vulnerabilities in the last layer, for example. Layers are just bringing in software. So when you're creating these containers or these images, in a better way to say it, you are adding things into a base image or a base operating system. So at the last stage of this, we're importing vulnerable libraries into our container or the runtime. And with these kind of tools, we can look in and see what these are. In this case, it's a vulnerable version of OpenSSH. And looking at this, we can find a manifest of all of our packages, what is running in our application, and developers can look at these manifests. It's almost like a bill of materials, right? Where we're throwing a product out to production, but we know exactly what's in it, and we know exactly where these vulnerable libraries are, and we can send out notifications, alerts, that kind of thing to our developers that are running these applications, and they can remediate things. We can also automatically remediate these issues. So If a library is detected to be vulnerable, we can query the version of that library, compare it to the latest or recent library that's in our open source or third-party libraries that are hosted externally, and we can force a rebuild of the application and a redeploy automatically. What that does is it effectively gets rid of a patch management program. And patch management is almost a nightmare for IT ops, because they either have to go to every machine and patch it, or they have a central tool set that they're patching and they're pushing patches out. The problem with that is if somebody turns off their machine at the end of the day and the machine isn't available for these patches, the patches don't get applied. And I've seen this many times on penetration tests that I've done, where I'll scan a network and I'll look at if somebody has a patch to that remediates some open source vulnerability with a critical vulnerability or severity level. And I'm always surprised to see that some of the vulnerabilities that have been available for years aren't applied to some workstations. And this is because those workstations might have been off when the patching process was going on. And this applies to servers as well. Servers are a lot easier to patch because they're usually always on, but a lot of times this patch management program doesn't address some of the vulnerabilities that might be out there. One of the other tools that we implement is static analysis and security testing. This is looking at what your team is developing and the quality of the code. So this is looking for things like SQL injection or injection vulnerabilities, which is a way that attackers can get into your database or infiltrate information and potentially access your system itself. It also looks at the quality of your code. It gives you an idea of a vulnerability is introduced here, and this is used in these other places, and then this is the eventual impact and effect of what this vulnerability can do to your environment. So it gives developers almost a trace of what the path is for this vulnerability being executed. It helps educate. But one of the problems with this tool set compared to the previous two I mentioned is this is pretty slow. It can be up to 48 hours. We've seen applications at Aetna that are 4.8 million lines of code that get scanned, and it takes almost 48 hours to do that. Digging into these code bases that are taking a long time, we notice that people are scanning or bringing in open source third-party components, and we're scanning those libraries. And that's what open source software management tools do, and they execute very quickly. And we're almost wasting processing time and effort scanning all these libraries that have already been scanned. So with static analysis, you're going to want to do it just for the code that your teams are developing and exclude everything else. So for larger or medium size applications, it's still going to take a little bit of time to get this done. And one of the things that we're trying to avoid with our pipelines and the way we deploy software is we want our security tools to operate in a rapid manner and not hold up the delivery of our software. Sometimes these analyses, like static code analysis or static analysis, have to be done out of band, which means they have to leave our development pipeline and go off on a separate track and then bring that information back in. By that time, the product might already be in production, but at least we know the remediation steps we need to fix that software. The ideal situation is if we're using microservices or a small amount of code, we can do what's called an incremental scan. So it's just looking at the changes that get put into the code base, and these things can happen rapidly. I've used these in our development pipelines that I triage, for example, for developing mobile applications. And we would like to have these execute as fast as possible so it doesn't hold us up. And the last one that I'm going to talk about today is dynamic analysis and security testing. So this is an attacker point of view from the outside of the application. So when you're product is deployed into a staging environment, you're going to want to run this to see, are there any low-hanging fruit that I don't know about? A lot of things that these find are vulnerabilities such as, not even vulnerabilities, but information disclosure. So you're going to be telling an attacker what version of Windows you're using, and you're powered by ASP.NET, and the attacker is going to go to ExploitDB, and it's a website that's out on the internet. They're going to search for Windows 2000 and ASP.NET 7.5 or IIS 7.5, and they're going to find vulnerabilities, and they're going to be a script kiddie and run those against your site and do some really, they can do some real damage. So in the case of having, for example, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., is defacement. That's one of their biggest concerns. And this is dynamic analysis is going to try to detect this information. It's going to look at cross-site scripting and that kind of thing. Now, the problem with these tools is they as well take a long time to run, and they're scanning very large amounts of vulnerabilities and potential exploits that can happen to the exterior of your application. Sometimes they're valuable, sometimes they're not. A lot of times I'll do this dynamic analysis on our products, and I'll find that, yeah, there's some information disclosure, but commercial products at this point are no different than a lot of open source products. So this is one place where I'm seeing DAST become a little bit less of a control that you're going to want to implement. And these are going to be replaced by things like RASP and IAST, which give you real-time information as the application is running in production. And you're seeing how people are using the application and what vulnerabilities are in there that are in the runtime. So then those run very fast. So it's almost like DAST is sort of, it's nice. It's going to give you some reconnaissance. So from a ethical hacking perspective, if you have teams in your environment, they'll use this to do some reconnaissance, but very rarely are they going to find things that the other tools won't find. So integrating the technology and putting all these pieces together. This is a sample merge and feature development. These are branches. So these are how your developers are looking at integrating code. So there's this master branch that's your gold line. This is your the place that you want to protect, and you want to make sure that vulnerabilities aren't in and aren't introduced by a developer. So developers will take what's called a feature, and then they'll develop a feature, merge this back into the development area, and then that will ultimately get merged into master. So there's a couple places where we can implement these security tools. We can do things immediately inside of our IDEs on a feature level. We can do security scanning when we're doing a merge, and then we can also do them when we're merging into master, and then we do them daily as well. So some of the components that our developers use might be something they developed 6 months ago. It hasn't had any maintenance applied to it, and nobody's really used it other than to package it and deploy it with their application into production. But what happens is those components or those applications get stale in your repository, and vulnerabilities come out every day. So scanning that stale code is going to detect if there's any vulnerabilities that need to be remediated. It's going to give you that insight that people have never had before. So this diagram is probably a little overwhelming, and it's evolved over time to
Sean. Hi, Sean. It's Karen. I'm sorry, DJ. Can I've got questions from Sean coming in. This is why I'm thinking about Sean. Hi, Sean, by the way.
Hey, Sean.
DJ, can you just hold on just for 1 second? I know it's just about noon, and I just wanted to let the people know that just pop in for lunchtime before they pop out about the next month's webinar. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So for those of you that do need to drop off, I'd just like to remind you that our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, October 18th, when Nick Schneider, managing partner from Simplify, joins us, and his presentation is titled Modernizing Service Management Processes with Self-Service Access. And Nick's webinar is driven by a range of initiatives, being DevOps, digital transformation, modern operations, etc. And Nick says, today's infrastructure and operations organizations are experiencing ongoing pressure to modernize established IT service management processes and practices. The impetus is to help streamline and accelerate software and service delivery to safely improve their organization's speed and responsiveness to the market. This presentation will provide real-world experiences and practical guidance on how to modernize key processes with self-service access to safely empower software developers with autonomy, feedback loops, and visibility across the end-to-end service development lifecycle. So please join us. We don't want you to miss that. And then, DJ, I'm going to give it back to you. And that gave them a few minutes to kind of, grasp that slide.
Oh, excellent.
Okay.
So am I back to this? Am I displaying here?
Yes, there you go.
Okay.
You're on. Thank you.
Okay, great. I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'm just going to cover this really quickly. And what I really want to focus on are some of the next slides that talk about KPIs. This is the idea of putting a change from, the product owner or something that's coming in to our release at the end of the day. And you can see these blue words and these blue elements on this system are the security elements that we're injecting in certain places. So we're doing things in the development environment. And when we check code in, then we're doing it along our pipeline as well. There's container vulnerability scanning, which we talked about, binary scrambling, which is a new technology that's coming out. And but then we have manual acceptance and manual ethical hacking, because these things can't be done in an automated way just yet. A lot of the information that we're bringing from our automated systems are going into the ethical hacking team as reconnaissance. But acceptance can either be manual or automatic. A lot of folks aren't necessarily confident that everything in the previous steps has been actually executed properly. So they want to do a manual approval or acceptance before it goes into production. Whereas an automated process can say, did all these tests pass? Did everything happen in the same order? Like, can we attest that open source software management was completed and then handed over to the static analysis? And that kind of thing. We're going to collect all this information that comes from these processes, and we're going to attach them back to that change so that we have the traceability of that change throughout the life cycle. We're also going to ship that information to our data analysis so we can do threat modeling and deep data analysis and security modeling of the information we're gathering. So potentially we can correlate these development issues with something that may be happening in the physical world. A lot of times physical attacks are accompanied by technology attacks. And then we can also send that to our SOC so that they have the information saying, we know there's a vulnerability here, and here's the impact and severity of this, and potentially the likelihood of this being exploited. And they can have that information in case there's a insecurity incident or something that they need to address, and send that information out to the development teams. So measuring everything, we want to use KPIs or key performance indicators to track a lot of the things that happen in our pipelines. And I'm going to go through a few that we use and some that we like to use. But a KPI for Aetna, Jim Routh, our CSO, likes to say that, a metric is just a number, and numbers you can't action, and numbers they don't really tell you anything. So you want to make sure that you're collecting relevant metrics and you're wrapping a KPI around it. So an action item, a threshold. If things are out of threshold, what do you need to do? These become part of your playbooks. And you have to make them relevant. If a KPI isn't relevant, it's just a waste of a number on a dashboard. And you also have to make sure they go to the appropriate people. So automating these KPIs, like collecting that information, disseminating it to the proper people, like the teams that need to address it, and then investigating these KPIs as well. So this is your action, like, we're out of threshold for security drag. What does that mean? We'll talk about on the next slide, but it's, what you need to do to see where these things are happening, what impact they have, and how to make that process more efficient. And that's what all this does. Really, you want to get to a point where KPIs drive efficiency and really reduce the drag or the problems in getting software out faster. So we had defect density goals in 2017 where we would allow one defect in 10,000 lines of code. And these are high vulnerabilities. And the defect density of 1.0 was our threshold. Anything above this needed immediate remediation and attention from our security organization. Anything less than this was less important for us to deal with immediately. So a lot of times we'll do a scan of a static code analysis scan, for example, of an application, and we'll find that the defect density is 53 or 23. And that means we parachute into that organization and really try to figure out what's going on. Chances are they're scanning third-party components, and once we remove that from the scan, it'll drop. And then there might be vulnerabilities that they introduce that we want to remediate and address as well. In 2018, we're going to a defect density of 0.0 or 0.006. And we call it the 006 project because it's a little bit better than 007. But we're doing this everywhere. And this is a stretch goal. Like, it's going to be hard. Like, do the calculations on this. This is one vulnerability in, oh my gosh, like I don't even know how many lines of code, but millions of lines of code. And this is making sure that, and these are high vulnerabilities again, this might look like a stretch, but the organization that we have in Denver has a 0.00000 defect density. They have no high vulnerabilities in their application. And once you get to that point with DevSecOps, you can start ratcheting the checking in vulnerabilities and say you're not allowed to check in any vulnerabilities into your source repository, and we can catch that right before a build happens, so we're not wasting compute power on building an application. That's how they did it at Aetna Digital, which is the successor to iTriage. And it was very effective. They, had a bug bash and, got everything down, made it a priority to get the defect density to 0. And now they can concentrate on medium vulnerabilities and eventually low. We like to have time implementation or remediation times around this, where high vulnerabilities are fixed within 90 days. Critical actually is has to be fixed immediately. Mediums with 180, and then lows, 365 days to remediate. We track that and hold our developers and our organizations accountable to make those timelines happen. So these are 5 security KPIs that I love to look at. Defect density is one again, and one of the other ones is the percentage of security-related work items that we have. So these are bugs, or vulnerabilities that we detect inside of our ITSM tool, or our work items inside of our Jira or Rally or something like that, or any of our work item tracking tools. We want to make sure that less than 15% of those items are a security vulnerability. And these thresholds and these percentages, we're going to drop as we get more successful in implementing our security programs. The other one I like to look at is the build time delay, especially from a security tool perspective. If a developer has to wait more than 2 minutes, they're going to call you. 5-minute execution time for these tools is really the target initially, and we're going to lower that as, again, we become more mature and we increase the performance of software delivery. We also want to look at failed builds, security drag in that situation. Like, how many builds are we failing because of a vulnerability? And we want to keep that less than 5%. That means that we're really well-oiled in this situation, where we're not failing builds just because of a vulnerability, and we're not introducing any drag in that situation. Like, if we kick back these vulnerabilities to our developers, we're interrupting the flow of our product into production. And the other one I like to look at is their defect escape rate. So These are vulnerabilities that are released into the production environment that we don't catch in our development process. And again, we want to have less than 10% here. We want to make sure that we're catching more vulnerabilities before we release, because it's more expensive as the product gets close to release. If we can remediate issues closer to the developer and before check-in, or even when the build process happens, we're going to save a lot of time and a lot of budget by having those developers address it immediately. Once it goes out to production, it becomes more expensive to identify, more expensive to get it out to production. So some of the challenges, you're going to hear fail fast, fail often, and you really rinse and repeat that. And this is a quote that I found which really addresses what DevSecOps and DevOps is. We're going to implement tools and we're going to try our best. And if they don't work as fast as we want them to, or they're the wrong tool for the job, or we don't have that technique around it, that's fine. We iterate on that rapidly. We use different tool sets, we introduce different processes. A lot of this comes from the developer and the DevSecOps, DevOps teams that are pushing these products out to production. They're going to see that they're not having a lot of success getting things out faster, or some tools aren't working. And that's not necessarily a failure, that's just an effect. But if you can react quickly, that's where the value is. And one of the things I like saying is, if you make 10% of an effort on something, you're going to have a bit of success, right? If you have 100% effort you put in, you're going to have 10% potentially failures. That's okay. If you don't try and you have 0% effort, you're going to have 0% failures, but you're also going to have 0% of your product being developed. So being a little bit easier on your developers, letting them learn from their mistakes, is going to increase the culture. It's going to increase the trust that leadership has in their development teams and their operation teams. And that's going to increase that culture at the end of the day. It's going to really make sure that there's this trust, and that trust is going to go a long way. And finally, the road ahead. It's going to keep evolving. DevSecOps is improving. We're having a lot more security tools come out. There's a concentration on making these tools faster. The idea is, don't just be not blinded, but attracted to the latest and greatest tool. Do the research around it, make sure you're doing a POC or a POV, and that this tool is valuable for your organization, because there's a lot of noise out there. A lot of companies are getting on this DevSecOps or DevOps, not bandwagon, but this movement, and introducing tools where they call them DevOps ready, or this is a DevOps tool. And when you dig into it, it's like, wow, this is just not even close. And as your teams improve their maturity, and as the executives and the leadership of your organizations look at how these programs are working, these DevSecOps adoption programs, you're going to be able to see what's real and what's not, or what's just flashy new technology versus product that actually makes a difference. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate your time on this webinar. You can reach me on Twitter, DJ Shalene, and devxops.ninja. And one of the questions was, what is the difference between DevSecOps, DevOps, and DevXops? DevOps is the foundation where DevSecOps builds on. DevSecOps is the introduction of security into DevOps, and DevXops is, it reduces the amount of arguments and friction I get from environments, because at the end of the day, it's QA, it's database, it's testing, it's development, it's operations. It's that whole idea that a feature team manages the feature all the way out into production. So it really doesn't matter what it's called. It could be called Rainbow Unicorn Pony. It's all DevOps, and it's all here, and it's all today. So I hope everyone enjoyed this presentation, and if there's any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Thank you, DJ. There. Rainbow unicorn pony. I like it. I like that.
I actually
Great,
showed one
great
at the user
information. We,
conference.
yeah, yeah, right. We have a lot of questions for you. And also, people are saying like, awesome job. Thank you. I mean, great information. I have just a quick question for you. I can see on the last screen that you have up here. I do have a couple of people asking if they can have your email address. Is that okay to share?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. All right. I will do that. Lisa, my colleague Lisa is here. She has a little bit of information to share with us for just a quick second. Lisa, you there?
I am. Oh my gosh, DJ. So DJ is going to be training our next continuous delivery architecture class, October 22nd through 26th. While you were talking, brother, I literally cleared my calendar. I will see you in class. I just learned so much, and you were able to take such a really, for a lot of people on the call, we saw in the in the surveys kind of the knowledge level coming in. You were able to take such complex ideas and break them down. So if I could understand it, everyone understood it. So I'm going to throw into the chat for everyone. We're running some promo codes on the CDA and the DevSecOps engineering courses, and I'll just put that in the chat. I'm going to stop talking and let you go on with the questions because there are a lot of great questions.
Oh, great. One thing I wanted to mention very quickly before we get into the questions is this is doable. Like if we can do this at a Fortune 50 organization with so many developers and so many teams spread across the world, any organization can move to this and move to it quickly. From a waterfall perspective, we were waterfall at Aetna just in the recent years, like in the past maybe 5 years. And we started adopting Agile based on a lot of the acquisitions we made and a lot of the things we saw and the value of these acquisitions. So, as we move through these adoptions and go to Agile and start implementing DevSecOps and DevOps, it's possible, it's doable, and it's not as hard as you might think it is. And from a question perspective, oh, sorry. Yeah, it should be. It should be, a lot of people look at security controls especially, and they're like, oh, developers are like, I don't want to do that. And there's always a trust issue between security. Traditionally, security has been a culture of no. Hey, I want to use Go. No. Hey, I want to adopt this framework. Security says no. And it's because of a lack of understanding. So if there's any organizations that are listening or any folks out there, if you don't have technical security folks on your staff, you definitely want to get a few of them if you're doing adopting DevSecOps, because they're going to be able to get in there and really help the development teams break down that whole friction between security and development. These traditional security teams, they're great because they handle GRC and third-party risk analysis, but there's becoming a lot of overlap between all these programs with development. So we need to bridge that gap. And Lisa and Karen, if you could state the questions or ask the questions. I can't actually open my chat window, so I'd appreciate that.
Yes, I'm going to do that for you. We've got about 12 minutes to get through the Q&A, Sean, and we've got quite a few really good questions here for you. So, you ready?
Yes, indeed. Let's go.
I'm ready. Okay. So, where changes equal DevSecOps practices, do you think educating those involved while these changes are being made is equally important as making the changes?
Yes, and I think that's a process of constant feedback, right? So, if you have a call center, for example, and you're tracking incidents, and a bunch of these incidents create a problem, and you decide that you want to make a change to the application. As those changes come in, everything that happens along the process needs to be brought into that artifact that gets created to track the change. And the reason why you want to do that is so the product owners, the stakeholders can know the progress of that change, how that change is going out. Just from a status perspective, it's having the information available. And as that information comes in, there may be some explanation to those stakeholders. What exactly does this mean? And this is where KPIs come in handy, dashboards come in handy. And I know there's like death by dashboard, but in our development areas, we have a lot of the development specific KPIs on a big screen. And if it turns red, we need to address it right away. And all of that it requires learning. This is where courses and certifications and the things that ITSM Academy and DevOps Institute are putting out there are very important, because it's going to create, not just for developers, but for business owners and product stakeholders, a common terminology, just like ITIL, to adopt these processes of DevSecOps and really understand what's happening.
Thank you, DJ. I have another question for you. It says, we are working hard on DevOps, and for us, a big part of that is modernizing our current service management. We think that SSA could really help. At Aetna, have you deployed self-service access? And if so, could you please talk about that?
Not for the DevSecOps pipelines and the development teams like that, but we do have areas of our environment where there's a self-service kind of component to these, where we create work items or tickets from it. We use some applications for our operations and our monitoring that are IT service management applications that are out there that track the process of remediation. But it really depends on organization and what kind of information you're bringing in, or what kind of self-service you want to bring into the organization. There might be a place where people inject changes, and it's a self-service change request that comes in. And then the evaluation process happens, and impact and severity get associated with it, and do we want to do this now? Do we want to do this later? And you can start prioritizing your work, right? But again, like DevOps and DevSecOps isn't a replacement for ITSM. They're very compatible, right? If you look at where the product owner sat on that pipeline, there's a lot of things that can happen before that, that we haven't even addressed. But that's where a lot of service management comes into, and as well the change management process, releasing and then monitoring it, and just taking information in the production environment and throwing it back into that process.
Right. Thanks, DJ. Well, in next month's webinar too, the October webinar with Nick Schneider, that's exactly what he's going to be talking about. So more information to come on that.
Oh, I'm definitely going to attend that one.
Yeah, right. I know. And then, okay, so I have another question for you. So when upgrading components, development teams have a couple of options. Either focus on a small update like 1.1.2 to 1.1.4 at a time, reducing time to complete, and make a small security impact. Make a small security risk, but generating a fair amount of technical debt. How would you recommend to balance that decision?
Well, that's an interesting one, and this goes into what we call component pinning. And developers have been doing this for years, and a lot of times it's done so that they don't introduce a break or some kind of technical debt that they need to remediate. But if you think about it in a different way, so with those versions or those component pins, what that means is they're saying we're going to use this third-party component, and we're going to only use this version, and they're going to pin it at that version, and there might be updates to that third-party component that happen over the years or months or even weeks that they're not implementing it, or they're not implementing, and that is acquiring massive amounts of technical debt. Even if there's no security vulnerabilities in it, there might be functionality changes, performance changes, things that help make your application more stable. So what I always say to developers is use latest. They're the latest code, and always clear your caches before you're pulling these components in, so you're getting the latest and greatest. Now, the risk associated with that is you might break some components of your application, and these are where some of these open source software management tools can really help you out. They can tell you where you have binary compatibility or feature compatibility to, and maybe you're just upgrading it to that version now and then putting a backlog item or a problem in there that's saying we need to remediate and bring that component up to the current state. Because of maybe additional security vulnerabilities that do a breaking change. So a couple different ways to do that. I always say that, again, pull the latest code, deal with it right away, and unless it's a massive amount of work, like you're really changing core functionality all across your application, just go to the point where you're not breaking or not doing a breaking change. And again, a lot of tools that you can use that plug in right into the IDE, and it's the right mouse button click, upgrade to the latest component, and that's about as fast as it can be. And that's rapid software development. And developers really like that because they don't have to think too much about it. They see where it is, see what the vulnerabilities are, and upgrade it. A lot of times they're just fixing all the vulnerabilities in one swoop and pushing that software out. No effort required, no technical debt acquired as well.
Great, thank you, DJ. We've got about 4 minutes left, and we've got a lot of questions, but I'm going to just pick 2 questions to take us through to the end of the webinar. And this one is, as part of the DevSecOps rollout in Aetna, did you receive any pushback from the security team members who saw the automation as a threat to their jobs, and how was this addressed?
Wow, that's a good question. The answer is really no. Everybody was on board, and I think that's because I'm very persistent, and I've been really, spreading the word internally about what kind of value this brings. And as an example, I've been sitting down with some developers. I've been talking about things like Kubernetes and deploying containers and security vulnerabilities, and all these new tools that came out are available today. A lot of open source stuff and a lot of commercial products. And the team asked me, what team are you part of? Are you a developer, enterprise architect? I'm like, no, I'm from global security. They were floored. Nobody had ever talked with them about technical security. And, I find that that's the biggest problem. One of the other, to answer the question a little bit more specifically, we didn't have a lot of pushback at Aetna around it, but I was doing a talk earlier this year, and the audience was made up of a lot of firewall and network management, groups, and I was doing a presentation on automation of firewalls and using your DevOps pipeline and infrastructure as code to create your firewall rules and change your firewall rules based on the code that you're putting out. And they all looked at me, and I could see the pain in their eyes because they're really saying that, wow, you just replaced all of our jobs. The way we want to handle that is take it as we're going to retool and change the way we're doing things. We're still doing the same kind of configuration of our firewalls in that case, but we're doing it in an automated fashion, so we have traceability, we have repeatability, and we can push out changes very quickly. So from a firewall perspective, we used to have to go to the IDE of these tool sets or even to the firewall itself and plug into the device, make the changes. And that's where these resources and these operators come in, and they were doing that traditionally for years. Now it's more of an education opportunity, and you might have some resistance to that, but again, it's about having a plan of rolling it out. Don't just throw it out there right away and say, hey, we're doing this now. Set the expectations, look at instructor-led training, computer-based training, and talk with your employees and talk with the folks that are doing this, and give them confidence that this is modern technology, this is the way the industry is going, and it's going to make them a more valuable resource, not just to your company, but to other companies. One of the things that Jim Routh said was, we want to make sure that we have the best security team and the highest trained security team available worldwide in any organization. Because if we're valuable, and even if we leave, we have this history of really succeeding and really taking it to the next level in our careers. It's a career enhancing move. So yeah, a lot of different points there, but it's a sensitive issue. The idea is you're not taking jobs, you're just changing roles.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, DJ. So we're out of time, but I've got one last question for you, because I think this one's important. It kind of flows right into that last question. If you have tried, what type of incentive programs have been successful with the DevSecOps adoption initiatives?
Oh, I love this question. And just a quick side note. I'm actually doing a DevOps certification tomorrow. So over the weekend and into next week, I'll actually answer each one of these questions individually and provide it to ITSM Academy to post so that there's a bit more formality to it and we can get to the questions that we didn't get to today. But to answer that question, there's a lot of different things you can do. So I'm a big fan of pizza and beer. I'm Canadian, so beer is like, again, it's not pluralized, it's just assumed, just like wine. We don't say mooses, we say moose. So what we can do is an incentive to, bug bash is having a bug bash program that's focused on not just security vulnerabilities, but general bugs in general. All that a vulnerability is just another work item, and all that a bug is just another work item. So I like just calling things work items. That's more palatable for a lot of developers and a lot of the leadership and product owners, is because there's a different impact and severity associated with it, but it's just a piece of work you have to do. So what we like to do is like different bug bashing events or things like that, where you stay a little bit later at the end of the day. Maybe for each bug or vulnerability that you fix, you get 10 minutes of PTO or something to that effect, just some sort of reward for completing as many bugs. So you might say, for the person who remediates the most issues in the next 2 hours, you're going to get a day off, or you're going to get a Amazon Alexa or Echo or something like that. And it just creates that competition. A lot of developers like that. It's they're either developing at work or they're developing at home, or and when they can stay a little bit later, even come in on a Saturday, like not office space style, but and do that together. That challenge also increases the cultural gel in the organization. So think of programs that offer some reward to development teams, and you can also threshold these issues so you can't introduce any new ones. And as you're bug bashing, you're lowering your threshold so you won't introduce any more vulnerabilities into that environment. So some interesting concepts around that, but be creative. Look at, even question the developers and say, we want to do something like a bug bash. What kind of incentive would you like to this? And give them some options, and then here's some options back. And that kind of communication, again, builds that culture.
You're suggesting ask them?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. A lot of times the executive level talks about adopting DevOps and DevSecOps, but they won't bring their developers into that conversation. And what that is death from above, right? So when you're not including everybody in the organization, you're excluding people of the organization. And people never like to be excluded, especially in a DevSecOps culture. You want to make sure everybody is on the same page and that you're getting everybody's input. So yeah, definitely ask the developers and say, or any of the DevOps team or DevSecOps team, what would incent you to reduce this vulnerability count?
Right. All right. Well, thank you, DJ. That's a lot of wisdom imparted on us today, and I certainly appreciate your time.
Yeah, I appreciate your time too. And I'm going to be doing a different talk on All Day DevOps. So you can register for free on alldaydevops.com. It's going to be called Don't Fear the Four Horsemen of DevSecOps, and it's going to go into a lot of issues and problems and things that we had to overcome as we started integrating these tools into our organization. So a little bit more of a deeper dive into things to watch out for. And it's a free conference.
Oh,
It's online.
great, thank you. We will sign up for that. And then once again, I'd like to remind everybody that our next webinar is on Thursday, October 18th, and that's when Nick Schneider, managing partner from Simplify, joins us, and his presentation is titled Modernizing Service Management Processes with Self-Service Access. And we'll send you all invitations for the next webinar and look forward to having you join us. And as you log out, if you could please take a minute to complete our post-webinar survey. It's really quick. It's just a couple of questions, and one of them being, what other topics would you like us to have at our monthly webinars? And we do use that list when we are selecting presenters. So please feel free to put in your topics for us. And be sure again to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn for the latest ITSM Academy updates and specials, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more webinars and inspiration. And again, thank you, DJ. It was very, very, very important information for us to have today, and really thank you for sharing all of your DevSecOps information with us. It was fantastic.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining. I love talking about this, and at the end of the day, it's about making the world a safer place for not only our parents and our grandparents, but for the children that come after us.
Right. Thank you. And I want to ask everybody to, again, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next month. Have a great day, everybody.